I do thank the Lord that I can be here this morning. I wasn't sure during the week if I would be able to, or at least if I'd be able to preach, because I had a very, very sore throat. I'm sure you've all had those before and know how miserable it is when you feel like you're swallowing razor blades every time you swallow. But I prayed that I'd be able to be here and that I could preach. And yesterday I started to get a little bit of relief, but my throat was still sore when I went to bed last night, but not as bad. And I woke up this morning and it didn't hurt at all. So thank the Lord for that. But I did, when I was speaking and starting to sing, I did feel like it's starting to hurt already again. So I'll see how far I can get through this. I don't know if I'll get through the whole sermon or not. We'll see. But I do want to continue preaching on suffering and deliverance. And last time we left off finishing up with Daniel, and now we're going to go back in the order of books in the Bible, back to Esther, but this would be ahead in time. I'm pretty sure that this the story of Esther happened after Daniel's life, I think, but it was in that same period of time when the Jews were under the Medo-Persian Empire, and Daniel's life, of course, began, or his book, his story that we read about him began under the Babylonian Empire, and then he also was there in the transition when the Medes and the Persians captured Babylon and conquered it. And this is in that same time period when the Jews are still in captivity under the Medo-Persian Empire. And that empire extended throughout most of the known world, even the whole way to India, and you read about that in the book of Esther. So that is the background of what I'm going to be talking about today. So we have the Jews in exile dispersed throughout the Medo-Persian Empire, and among those Jews was a man named Mordecai. Mordecai had a young cousin named Hadassah. Her name was changed to Esther by the king Ahasuerus probably when she became his wife. It doesn't exactly say. It just says here in Esther 2 and verse 7 that he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther. But anyway, let's start in verse 5, and we're going to see here where this book got its name from. That is from this young lady Hadassah, whose name was changed to Esther, who was the adopted daughter of this man named Mordecai. In Esther 2, verses 5 through 7, it says, "Now in Shushan the palace there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which had been carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away." So we've already been over Jeconiah. You remember we looked at Jeremiah and how he ministered in the days of Zedekiah. And then right after that we looked at Jeconiah, also known as Coniah, also known as Jehoiakim. I think that was all the same name there when you compare the passages. Anyway, this is the man that was carried away captive by Nebuchadnezzar first, several years before he came back and then finished the job and took Zedekiah to Babylon and took most of the remaining Jews to Babylon. Mordecai was one of the men that was carried captive in that first carrying away under Jeconiah. Verse 7, "And he brought up Hadassah," that is Mordecai. "He brought up Hadassah," that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter." His uncle's daughter, which would mean it was his cousin, and I'm assuming that he was a lot older than she was, which often happens especially in those days when you had large families and you could have 20 years between the oldest sibling and the youngest sibling, and a lot of times people were aunts and uncles before they were ever born. That's That's not uncommon at all. In fact, my grandfather was an uncle a number of years before he was born. His sister got married pretty early, like 12 years old or something, and had 12 kids, and so they got the cart before the horse. They even did that back in those days. So anyway, that's how it happens sometimes. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. I'm trying to shorten up this sermon and then chasing rabbits about stuff that's not even necessary. So anyway, Mordecai took his cousin under his wings as if she was his own daughter. Well, this turned out to be a very fortuitous event for the sparing of the whole Jewish nation, as a matter of fact, and we'll see that as we go through this. So, long story short, Esther ended up becoming the queen after the former queen was deposed. Her name was Vashti or Vashti. Just very briefly, the king had a big party with a bunch of his lords and officials, and the queen was having some kind of a party of her own, and the king wanted the queen to come over and parade around and let all the men see her beauty. And for whatever reason, she didn't want to do that, and she refused to do that, and that made him very angry. And he was concerned that if word got around that the queen just blatantly disobeyed the order of her husband, that other women in the empire might start to do likewise, and that would not be good. So they decided just to get rid of her, and he just put her away from being queen, and he was going to get a new queen. So he had all these young ladies in the empire all trying out for it. It was kind of like an episode of The Bachelor or something. And so they spent a couple of years preparing themselves and all this, and all coming before him. And the one that caught his favor the most was Hadassah, that is Esther. And she ends up becoming queen instead of Vashti. Esther 2:16 through 17. I'm just giving you the cliff notes here. I don't have time to go through this entire book. So Esther was taken unto King Ahasuerus into his house royal in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Well then, skipping ahead a bit, there was a man named Haman, and Haman was promoted above the other princes in the realm. Now, the king had good taste in women, apparently, but bad taste in servants and in people that he was going to appoint to his cabinet, because Haman was a terribly wicked man. But in Esther 3 and verse 1, it says, "After these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes that were with him." It just seems to happen. I don't know why it happens. I mean, it happens in government, and it happens in companies too, where sometimes the guys that are just proud, arrogant jerks get promoted to the top for some reason. And I don't know why. I mean, maybe they're the ones that get stuff done, or I don't know why that happens. But anyway, here's a case of that. And if you know this story, you know that Haman was a very exceedingly proud man, which we'll look at here in just a second. Well, the king commanded his servants to bow down before Haman. I'm not sure why he did that, but that's what he did. And, of course, everybody did it except for one. That was Mordecai. Mordecai the Jew would not bow down before Haman. He refused because he was a Jew. The idea being there, of course, it was forbidden by his God to do so. Verses 2 through 4. Esther 3, 2 through 4. "And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him." So this actually wasn't something that Haman came up with on his own. This is something that the king told them to do. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence. And that, you want to make somebody mad, you just don't give them the respect that they think they're due. And that'll get you on their bad side, as we'll see here. "Then the king's servants, which were in the king's gate, said unto Mordecai, Why transgressest thou the king's commandment? Now it came to pass, when they spake daily unto him, and he hearkened not unto them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's matters would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. When they asked him, Why don't you bow? What did Mordecai tell him? I'm a Jew. I can't bow down to a man. I can't serve a man. I only, like Jesus told Satan, Thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only shalt thou serve. That was all he had to tell him, though, that he was a Jew. And they kept after him. It says, now there in verse 4, Now it came to pass, when they spake daily unto him, and he hearkened not unto them. It was every day. Hey, Mordecai, you need to bow down to Haman. Sorry, I'm a Jew. Can't do it. Every day Haman comes by, Mordecai stands, everybody else bows down. Hey, Mordecai, you got to start bowing here. The king said it. Mordecai says, Sorry, I'm a Jew. I'm not going to do it. See, this is a man of faith right here. Of course, you know one of my favorite verses, Acts 5:29. We ought to obey God rather than men. And that's exactly what he was doing, obeying God rather than men. He wouldn't compromise regardless of the consequences. Now I'm going to skip ahead here in time just a little bit. What happens is, and I'll get to this, but what happens is Haman gets really upset, and not only does he want to kill Mordecai, but he determines that he's going to kill the entire Jewish people in that empire. And even in spite of that, Mordecai still won't bow down. Esther 5 and verse 9. This verse is said after Haman talks the king into massacring all of the Jewish people. Now, the massacre hasn't happened yet. We'll look at that and see why it took a long time to happen. But after this has been decreed, and after all the Jews know that they're mincemeat, and basically the reason for it was that this man Mordecai would not bow down, and after all that, he still won't bow down. Esther 5 and verse 9. Then went Haman forth that day joyfully and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood not up, nor moved for him, he was full of indignation against Mordecai. Mordecai knows that he's got a target on him, that he's basically a dead man, and he still won't bow down. Now, a lesser man would have said, okay, whatever, I'll just bow down. Maybe it'll placate Haman, and maybe then he'll change his mind. He won't try to murder me and all the rest of the Jews. But not Mordecai. He just stood there. He still wouldn't bow down. I really like this guy. And he was eventually rewarded and exalted for his faithfulness. Let's just jump ahead a little bit further, even in Esther 8 and verse 15. And Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel, in a blue and white, and with a great crown of gold, and with a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. And then in chapter 9, verses 3 through 4, and all the rulers of the provinces and the lieutenants and the deputies and the officers of the king helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame went out throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai waxed greater and greater. So I just skipped ahead there a little bit just to show you, just give you a sneak peek of what happens. Mordecai would not bow down, and he was eventually exalted highly for it. And we'll see that as we go through the story. So now getting back to what happens here. So Mordecai wouldn't bow down, and Haman was full of wrath when he found this out. And he set out to destroy all the Jews in the kingdom, not just Mordecai. And maybe it appears that he didn't think he could get away with murdering Mordecai. He didn't know how he would do that. So if I talk the king into massacring all the Jewish people, all of Mordecai's people, well, Mordecai will be collateral damage in there, and I'll get rid of him, and I'll get rid of the rest of these pesky people as well. Esther 3, 5 through 6. And when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then was Haman full of wrath. And he thought scorned to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had showed him the people of Mordecai. Wherefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. So he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Not a good idea to just lay hands on Mordecai. They just couldn't figure out how he was going to be able to do this without, creating a scene and getting himself in trouble. So next best thing, we'll just genocide the whole Jewish race in the kingdom. That'll work too. So Haman went to the king, and he talked him into destroying all the Jews. Verses 8 and 9. And Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom, and their laws are diverse from all people, neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. If it please the king, let it be written, that they may be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have the charge of the business, to bring it into the king's treasuries. So he goes to the king and he says, hey, there's these people, and they're scattered throughout the empire, and they've got these weird laws, and they don't obey your laws, and they just kind of do their own thing, and it's just not in your best interest to have these people around, and let's just massacre them, and I'll take all this silver and I'll pay off these mercenaries basically, and we'll get them to kill all these Jews and then put it back in the king's treasury. I don't know if they were going to get spoil from the Jews or what, but somehow we're going to get paid back, and we'll get all this money back into the treasury. So the king foolishly goes ahead with it and gives his consent without even knowing who he had agreed to genocide. Not realizing that his own wife, his new queen, was one of these people that have these weird laws that don't obey your laws and all that. He didn't even bother to check that it's his own wife who's going to be subject to this genocidal order. He obviously wasn't thinking. Esther 3:10 through 11. And the king took his ring from his hand and gave it unto Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the Jews' enemy. And the king said unto Haman, The silver is given to thee, the people also, and do with them as it seemeth good to thee. When he took off his ring and gave it to him, that's for the seal, right? That the kings would have a ring with their seal on it, and when they would make some kind of a decree, it would be imprinted. So they'd have the decree, and then it would be sealed with some wax, and the king would put his ring and impress that wax, and everybody knew it came from the king. So he puts his official what do they call that? The Catholics, there's a name for that, a book that's been sanctioned by the Catholic Church. Not premature. Anyway, I can't think of the word I'm thinking of here. Anyway, I can come up with it later. Imprimatur, I think that's what it's called, or that may not be how you pronounce it. But anyway, so you don't even know what I'm talking about anyway. So all that rigmarole for nothing. Okay, so he goes ahead and just puts his stamp on it. And what Haman had done is what is referred to in Psalm 94 and verse 20 as framing mischief by a law. And boy, was this ever mischief. Genociding an entire people. If that's not mischief, I don't know what would be. In Psalm 94 and verse 20, it says, Shall the throne of iniquity have fellowship with thee, which frameth mischief by a law? And that's what this was, a throne of iniquity. Haman and Ahasuerus together, framing mischief by a law, although the king was doing it unwittingly. Just because something's a law doesn't mean it's lawful. Just because something's legal doesn't mean it's lawful. Just because some government official enacts some kind of a decree doesn't necessarily mean that it's right or that it even should be obeyed at all. And this is, of course, one of those cases. This law should not have been obeyed. The king had hearkened to lies, and this was indicative that he had some wicked servants. If you turn over to Proverbs 29 and verse 12, this is an interesting verse, which kind of reveals what's going on in the king's cabinet if he's a man that listens to lies that are fed to him. Proverbs 29 and verse 12, if a ruler hearken to lies, all his servants are wicked. Now, why would his servants be wicked if he hearkens to lies? Who's telling him the lies, right? It's the servants that are feeding him the lies. He's got a bunch of wicked servants. I've got Bush written next to that verse. The ruler that hearkened to lies and launched those wars and did all the mass murder. His servants were wicked. Rumsfeld, Cheney, Wolfowitz. What's his name, that old dude? Kissinger. Right? His servants were wicked. If you don't have much going on upstairs, like old W, at least get yourself some wise, good advisors that aren't going to tell you to do all kinds of horrible things. Okay, so Haman devised this wicked plot in the first month of the year. Now this is really interesting. Esther 3 and verse 12. Then were the king's scribes called on the 13th day of the first month, and there was written according to all that Haman had commanded unto the king's lieutenants, and to the governors that were over every province, and to the rulers of every people of every province, according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language. In the name of King Ahasuerus was it written and sealed with the king's ring. So this decree that the king sent out to all the governors of all the provinces, and I think, if I'm remembering right, there were 127 provinces, I'm pretty sure, in this kingdom. And it's said here somewhere in the book of Ruth, I don't remember where it is. So this goes out throughout all the land, the whole way from, the Persia would be in like modern day Iran today. That's why Iran used to be called Persia. So Middle East anyway. But this kingdom, like I said, extended the whole way out to India. So anyway, this thing goes out, but it goes out in the first month of the year. Now this is going to be a very fortuitous event because they had cast pur, which was a lot, to determine when to destroy the Jews, and the lot landed on the 12th month of the year. You got to compare a few verses to see this, but in Esther 3:7, it says, in the first month, that is the month Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is the lot, before Haman, from day to day and from month to month, to the 12th month, that is the month Adar. So they cast the lot because they're trying to figure out when they're going to genocide the Jews. And they're superstitious, so they're doing this lot thing, right, to try to figure out when would be the time. And it goes from month to month, and it lands on the 12th month. And if you look in chapter 9 and verse 24, it'll make this pretty clear. Esther 9:24. Because Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had devised against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast pur, that is the lot, to consume them and to destroy them. So it wasn't crystal clear from chapter 3 and verse 7, but it makes it crystal clear that casting the lot, was to determine when to destroy the Jews, and it landed on the 12th month. in chapter 3 and verse 13, and the letters were sent by post into all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to cause to perish all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, even upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and to take the spoil of them for a prey. Like I said, that's how they were going to get the money back in the treasury. So it was going to be in the 12th month, on the 13th day of the month, and this decree was sent out in the first month, on the 13th day of the month, there in verse 12. So we see here that the Lord had providentially given the Jews 11 entire months to buy them time to be able to defend themselves. Now we'll get to that later. But it's interesting that this book, and I know I've told you this before, this book is the only book in the Bible that does not contain the name of God in any form. God, Lord, Jehovah, anything. There's no mention of God's name whatsoever in this book. But God's providence is woven throughout the whole thing. Just like this. They cast this lot to determine when to destroy the Jews, and it gives them 11 entire months before that day comes. This is summed up pretty well by Proverbs 16:33, which says, "The lot is cast into the lap, but the whole disposing thereof is of the Lord." Why did that lot come up for the 12th month? It wasn't just because of chance. It was because the Lord caused it to do that. He controlled chance in that sense. And they got the 12th month because that's what the Lord wanted them to get. So the copy of the decree went out, and as you can imagine, the city of Shushan, which was where the palace was perplexed. Verses 14 and 15. Esther 3:14 and 15. The copy of the writing for a commandment to be given in every province was published unto all people, and that they should be ready against that day. The posts went out, being hastened by the king's commandment, and the decree was given in Shushan the palace. And the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Shushan was perplexed. So they got all their work done, wrote out these copies, mailed them out through the post office. And they're like, well, our work is done now. For 11 more months, they sat down and took a drink. Well, the people of Shushan are like, what is going on here? You're just going to massacre all these Jews? For what reason? What have they done? So they're perplexed. And this is something that we will experience as Christians. We will be perplexed. But one thing we never want to be is in despair. If you look in 2 Corinthians 4 and verse 8, we will feel like these Jews did. At times, confused, befuddled, not understanding why things like this are happening. But you never want to be in despair, because the Lord's always in control. The Lord will always, He's always there to take care of you and provide for you, and turn the tables around. 2 Corinthians 4 and verse 8 says, we are troubled on every side, yet not distressed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. It's okay to be confused, perplexed. I'm confused a lot of times. I'll be the first to admit that I don't understand why God does a lot of the things that He does. I have no idea. Things that I've experienced in my own life, and things that I've seen other people experience in their lives, and I look at that and I think, why? Why would you do that, Lord? You have infinite power, and you could certainly stop it or cause something else to happen. Why? But you can't be in despair. You can be confused, but don't be in despair. And a mark of maturity, I think, a mark of Christian maturity, is when you can resolve to just be okay with the fact that you don't understand what's going on. You don't understand why God's doing what He's doing, but you know that He knows what He's doing. And you can rest in that assurance that you have faith that the Lord knows what He's doing, and He's doing everything for a purpose. Sometimes I think that's why He allows us to be confused and perplexed, is just so we know who's in control. Because if everything went according to our will and our desire, well, who's in control? And who are you going to look to for help? And who are you going to go to when you're in trouble? Well, you wouldn't have to, because everything's going according to your plans. When the Lord throws a wrench in the plans, I think sometimes He does so just so you realize that He's in control, and sometimes He makes it a real difficult one to figure out, just so you know that He's in control, not you. Well, there was a great mourning among the Jews when they learned about this decree. Esther 4:1-3. When Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth with ashes and went out into the midst of the city and cried with a loud and a bitter cry, and came even before the king's gate, and for none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting, and weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Which, the whole thing is it's perplexing to me, even knowing the story, why the king would do this, and why the king wouldn't say, now, who are these people again? Who is it that we're going to be massacring, and why? What about these laws that they have that are different than ours? It's just so strange that he would do something like this and just think nothing of it. But typical psychopath, I guess. No empathy for anybody else's sufferings. Well, Queen Esther heard about the lamentation and sent to find out what happened. So she calls, and I'm just going to spare my voice and not read all these verses here in verses 4-7, but she wants to find out what happens. And Mordecai, he told her that she needed to go to the king to make supplication for her people, in verse 8. Also, he gave him a copy of the writing of the decree that was given at Shushan to destroy them, to show it unto Esther, and to declare it unto her, and to charge her that she should go in unto the king to make supplication unto him, and to make request before him for her people. So Mordecai sends her this note and says, hey, you're our last chance here. You have an in with the king. You need to go and talk to the king and tell him what's going on here. Well, Esther told Mordecai that she could be killed for approaching unto the king uninvited, verses 11 and 12. It says, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come unto the king into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come in unto the king these 30 days. And they told to Mordecai Esther's words. So she's letting Mordecai know, maybe something he didn't know, that if you're not invited to the king's chamber and you show up there, there's a law for that, and the law says you die, unless he extends the golden scepter and has mercy on you. And that's a picture of God's sovereign grace right there. You come to him on his terms, not your own. So Mordecai tells her that if she does nothing, that the Lord will deliver the Jews another way. But this is basically her time. She needs to do this. If she doesn't, it's going to be her and her father's house are going to die. And the Lord will deliver all the Jews in another way. So basically, Esther, if you do this, you're going to deliver the people. If you don't do this, you and your immediate family here are going to die, but the Lord will deliver the Jews in another way. Verses 13 and 14. Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. You're not going to get out of this alive either, Esther. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place, but thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. So, Esther, if you won't stand up for your people, you and your house are going to suffer for it, but God will raise up somebody else that will take care of the rest. So we always want to remember that. Sometimes we feel like we don't want to stick our neck out. We want to make sure and save our own skin because, if I'm the one that stands up, maybe I'll be destroyed and it's not going to make any difference anyway. Well, what might happen is if you don't stick your neck out, you'll be destroyed, and then God will use somebody else to deliver the people that he wants to deliver. So just remember that. That's a good lesson for us to remember. And then Mordecai tells her that it's possible that she has been put in this position for just this specific time. The second part of verse 14. He says, "And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Who knoweth? Don't we still talk like that today? Who knows if this isn't because of, or for such and such a reason, right? We say that all the time. Well, obviously she was come to the kingdom for such a time as that. The Lord put her in that position because she was going to be used to deliver his people. Now, we must remember that we likewise have been put in the place and time that we are in by God to do what he has for us to do. We are living in this place and in this time so that we can do what God has for us to do. Why weren't we born a generation ago and we didn't have to go through all the stuff in 2020 and 2021 and whatever else lies in the future? Well, it's because God put us here at this time for this reason, and this is our time. This is our time to stand up. It's our time to resist the powers of darkness who are attempting to close down churches and keep us in fear. This is our time. This is our battle. This is our fight. Now maybe the battle's over. Maybe they won't try to close churches down again. I doubt it. I think that they're going to keep trying to do that. I'm pretty sure Satan has the idea of world dominion, world government, world religion. He's not really wanting churches to be assembling, especially true ones. So we'll probably have our chance again, and this is our time to resist. Hopefully I don't get censored on YouTube again for that. Last week's video, taken down. It didn't even... Yeah, right. Yeah, I'm getting a note here. Going to get myself censored again. The previous videos had bad words in the titles, in the title or description or tags. By bad words, I mean like mask and the V word and things like that. Last week's sermon didn't have anything in titles or tags, so they're apparently scanning the audio with their AI bots, and they heard me say bad things last week, very dangerous things. So anyway. Thankfully, your strikes go away after 3 months. Your warning remains, but my strike went away, so I currently only have one strike, even though I've been stricken twice, but I only have one on the record right now. See how long that lasts. All right, anyway, so Esther determined to go into the king, not regarding her own life. Esther 4:15 through 16. Then Esther bade them return Mordecai this answer: Go gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. Love that. Remember those words. If I perish, I perish. She's going to go into the king, which is not according to the law. She's going to break the law and knowingly do so, and if it costs me my life, so be it, she says. That's a brave woman right there. That's what you call civil disobedience. It's a godly thing to do. Well, long story short, Mordecai was exalted to a place of honor, and Haman's plot was exposed, and he was hanged on the gallows that he built for Mordecai. Just a very brief explanation, if you remember what happened. The king had trouble sleeping one night, and he has the chronicles of the kingdom read to him, basically all the boring stuff that happens in government, to try to make him fall asleep. And he reads a story about this guy named Mordecai foiling a plot of these two reprobates that tried to kill the king. And Mordecai had turned them in, and they were hanged. And the king's hearing about this, and he's like, well, what's happened to Mordecai? Well, how has he been honored, or paid back, repaid for this graciousness that he did to me? And they say, oh, nothing, apparently. And so the king calls Haman, and he says, hey, Haman, what should I do to honor a man that I want to honor? And Haman, being the proud fool that he is, thinks, well, who else could it be talking about? I mean, got to be about, me. Well, I'll tell you what you should do. Get out the royal apparel and clothe him with that. Put a crown on his head. Put him on a horse. Parade him through the city and announce that thus shall it be for the man the king wants to honor. I mean, put on a great big parade for this guy. Of course, Haman's thinking this is all going to happen to him. And the king says, great idea, Haman. Do that to Mordecai. The guy that you hate so much that you want to kill? Well, Mordecai gets, elevated to this great position of honor. And then, in the meantime, as this is happening at the same time, Esther's gone to the king and said, hey, I want to have this banquet. And I want to invite Haman to the banquet. And, we're going to put on a nice little show here. And I something I want to tell you, but I want to tell you at this banquet, and I want to make sure Haman's there for it. And so Haman, he's all puffed up because this is great that the queen's invited him to this banquet, and he's so special, and the king wants him to be there. And so Esther at the banquet reveals the little secret. It's that this wicked Haman has plotted to kill my people. And Haman realizes that he's in big trouble now, and the king's really upset, and the king goes out to blow off some steam in the garden, and Haman gets up on the bed with Esther and trying to plead for his life, and the king comes in and sees him, basically doesn't look very good, him with Esther in the bed, and so he commands him to be hanged. And I've read that verse so many times, I don't even think I'll read it again, but they said, hey, we got this gallows here, 75 feet tall, and the king says, hang him thereon. And that's what they did. Verse 7:10, so they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. Well, then Mordecai was set over the house of Haman. This is what you call poetic justice right here. Haman sought to destroy and kill Mordecai on this big gallows that he made. Haman gets the gallows. Mordecai gets Haman's house. Isn't that something? Esther 8:1-2. On that day did the king Ahasuerus give the house of Haman the Jews' enemy, unto Esther the queen, and Mordecai came before the king, and Esther had told what he was unto her, because the king didn't know this at this time. He knew who Mordecai was, but he didn't realize that Mordecai was the cousin / stepfather, adopted father of his new wife, his queen wife. So he finds out now. And the king took off his ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it unto Mordecai, and Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. I imagine the house of Haman was a little bit nervous at this point, having Mordecai set over them. Well, the Jews were granted by the king the right of self-defense to fight off the mercenaries who were hired by Haman. Esther 8:11. Wherein the king granted the Jews which were in every city to gather themselves together, and to stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, and to cause to perish all the power of the people and province that would assault them, both little ones and women, and to take the spoil of them for a prey. So he gives them the right of self-defense. They have, remember, 11 months to prepare, and he tells them now, you get ready. And because of the law of the Medes and the Persians, remember, and it can't be undone, so this decree couldn't be changed. But what he could do is make another decree and say, he decreed these people to kill the Jews, and now he can decree the Jews to fight back against these people. I mean, it's kind of, the typical of government. The right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing, but, in this case, it's all he could do. So the Jews were granted this right of self-defense, and the Jews destroyed those that tried to destroy them. And Haman's 10 sons were killed and hanged on the gallows. In Esther 9, 1 through 6, which I'm not going to read this either. Forgive me, you can read it on your own clock. But basically what happens is that the Jews fight back and they destroy the people that were going to destroy them. And I'm just trying to save my voice here because it's not feeling very good at the moment. And then Haman's sons are killed and hanged on the gallows. And you can read about that in Esther 9, 7 through 10, and then 14. Now, that happened right there in Shushan, right close to where the king was. And I think they slew something like 50,000 if I remember. I can't, I'm just scanning down through there if I can see that. Anyway, they killed a bunch there, but then throughout the empire, likewise, 500, pardon me, verse in 9:6, they destroyed 500. But then throughout all the provinces in the empire, they slew 75,000 of their enemies. Esther 9 and verse 16. But the other Jews that were in the king's provinces gathered themselves together and stood for their lives, and had rest from their enemies, and slew of their foes 75,000. But they laid not their hands on the prey. So this was quite the success in the battle. 75,000 men that they killed. The Jews went from mourning and lamenting and being worried about being destroyed to really conquering their enemies here. And then they made a national holiday to commemorate their great deliverance. And that's in chapter 9, 17 through 23. I'm just going to, let's just do verse 20. And Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters unto all the Jews that were in all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus, both nigh and far, to establish this among them, that they should keep the 14th day of the month Adar and the 15th day of the same yearly, as the days wherein the Jews rested from their enemies, and the month which was turned unto them from sorrow to joy, and from mourning into a good day, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, and send portions one to another, and gifts to the poor. And the Jews undertook to do as they had begun, as Mordecai had written unto them. And I believe they called this day Purim. I don't see that here, but I'm pretty sure it was called Purim. Verse 28, thank you. Yes, it was called Purim. So it ended up being a national holiday, which I think that the Judaics celebrate even to this day, as far as I know. And then Mordecai was made second in command of the entire Medo-Persian Empire. The last verse of the chapter, Esther 10 and verse 3. For Mordecai the Jew was next unto King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and accepted of the multitude of his brethren, seeking the wealth of his people, and speaking peace to all his seed. he's at least the third person in Jewish history that was second in command of a world empire. Joseph, Daniel, and Mordecai. It's quite interesting. Of the 6 world empires that we've had up until the Roman Empire, of the 6, 3 of them had Jews second in command of them at one point or another, which is pretty interesting if you think about it. All right, so there are some lessons that we can learn from this. Lesson number 1. God can protect us when we are living in a country or a culture which is hostile to us. I mean, you think that your government and your countrymen are hostile to you. You know, think about what the Jews were facing, in the days of the Medo-Persian Empire. God made a way to protect them in the midst of that, and He can protect us in the midst of the opposition that we face. Lesson number 2. We must always obey God rather than men, regardless of the consequences. Because the consequences for Mordecai were death. And he did it anyway. He obeyed God rather than men, and he was spared from death, and all his people were spared from death. Likewise, Esther obeyed God rather than men. She went into the king. Could have been her life. She was spared from death and spared her people. So you always obey God rather than men. Don't worry about the consequences. Lesson number 3. God will bless those who serve Him without compromising their faith, which is basically what I just said. Lesson number 4. The wicked will eventually fall into the pit which they have digged, and will reap what they have sown. Haman got what was coming to him. He digged a big old deep pit. And guess what? He fell into it. He was trying to roll a stone over the Jews, and he stumbled, and that thing rolled back right over himself. That's what happens. He sowed the wind, and he reaped the whirlwind. So that's how God operates. Lesson number 5. Pride goeth before destruction. Haman was an exceedingly proud man, like we saw, and his end was destruction. That's what happens to proud people. A haughty spirit before a fall, the Scripture says. Lesson number 6. God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. There's little humble Mordecai. He's basically a nobody. He even saved the king's life one time, and nobody even recognized him. Everybody forgot about him. He was just a humble guy. He wasn't up there. And, he could have been like a lot of us, and after we saved the king's life and we wait a day or two and nothing happens, and you go up to the palace and say, hey, you realize that was me, right, that exposed this plot? Not Mordecai. He never said a word. He was a humble man, and God gave grace to him and resisted old proud Haman. Lesson number 7. God can overrule wicked laws which are passed to persecute His people. And throughout history that has happened. Persecution has been sanctioned by law. In the Roman Empire, it was sanctioned by law. Christians were fed to the lions and tortured and murdered under state edict. And that was the policy of the Soviet Union, of a lot of these communist dictatorships, Mao's China and North Korea. Christians are not treated well at all, and so there's a lot of places in the world which persecution is by edict of law. But God can overrule those wicked laws. Lesson number 8. God controls circumstances so that the outcome benefits His faithful people. Remember the lot? They cast the lot, and God controlled that lot so that His people would have almost a year to prepare themselves. So God can control circumstances, and He does. Lesson number 9. God can save His people from their enemies when they are greatly outnumbered. I don't know how many Jews there were throughout the provinces, but though there were a number, there weren't anywhere near the amount of people that were in the Medo-Persian empire, in the kingdom. They were obviously vastly outnumbered, and yet God used those few Jews to slay all kinds of their persecutors. Remember Gideon. He used 300 men with Gideon to slay 100. I think they were up against 135,000 Midianites or something like that. 450 to 1. Who hath despised the day of small things, the Scripture says. It doesn't, just because we're small in number and we're vastly outnumbered, that doesn't matter at all. Noah was vastly outnumbered, like millions to 8, and you know how that turned out. Lesson number 10, God can put His children in high places in government and use them to deliver His people. You never know who God might put up in some high echelon of the government. Somebody, as I've said before, could be whispering little sweet nothings into the ear of the president or something, and He could have mercy upon us. I was told Queen Whitmer up there in Michigan, when she put out her decrees about all the lockdowns and the shutdowns, she specifically left churches exempt from those lockdown decrees, because she had there was some guy, and I forget who he was, but somebody in the government in Michigan that was a Christian, and I don't know if this is absolutely proven or people just assumed it so, but I think they knew this, that he had talked to her, and he had talked her into not making churches subject to those lockdown orders in Michigan. They were exempt from it. And she's a wicked person, so that just shows you. God can have people up there in government that can affect things for the benefit of His people. Lesson number 11. And by the way, and just along those lines, look at what's happening now up in Canada. You have in Alberta, they've dropped all the vaccine mandate requirement and the vaccine passports. In Saskatchewan, the same thing. In Quebec and Prince Edward Island, I think. So the dominoes are really falling up there. And it just shows you that God can, at any time, He can turn this whole thing around and make it all disappear if He wants to. And, a few 100,000 truckers don't hurt either. But, God can use whoever He wants to accomplish whatever He wants. Lesson number 11. We were born for the time in which we live, and we should boldly fight the battles that God has put us in. That's like I said earlier. We were born for this time, and you need to fight. You need to take up the mantle that God has given you. We need to pick up the baton, and we need to fight. When it comes to fighting for our right to assemble and worship God as He has commanded us, we need to fight for that and never give up on that and never capitulate and give in to any of the powers that be and whatever they try to force upon us in that regard. And lesson number 12. If we are faithful over the little that God has given us, He'll make us ruler over many things. Turn with me to Matthew 25:21. Because this is what happened to Mordecai. Mordecai was faithful in that little that God had given him. Whatever his position was, he was faithful, and he was not going to bow down. He was not going to compromise. And because of that, he was made ruler. He was honored and paraded around about. Then he was made in charge over the house of Haman, and then he was made second in command of the entire Medo-Persian Empire because he was faithful and wouldn't compromise. Matthew 25 and verse 21, his Lord said unto him, Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler over many things. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord. And you remember that. Maybe God hasn't given you great things to do. You're not in some high position of government. You're just a nobody like we all are. But you know what He has given you to do? Well, He's given you to be faithful in His house, show up to church and worship God every Sunday. He's given you a family to take care of if you're a father or your mother or whatever. He's given you a wife to take care of. He's given you a husband to take care of. Right? We've got business to do. Fear God and keep His commandments. Right? We may not have been called to do wonderful, amazing things, but we've been called to do little things. And if we do the little things that God has commanded us to do, He'll make us ruler over great things, over more things. Problem with a lot of people is they want to do the great things. They want to lead a revolution. They want to, they want to reform the halls of government, but they don't want to reform their own life. You always want to be careful of that. Just do those little things that God's given you to do, and He'll bless you with more as He sees fit. And that takes care of the Jews' national destruction being averted there in the days of Esther. And next time, Lord willing, we'll look at how Judah was saved out of the Babylonian captivity.